Welcome to this last session of this conference. We're going to listen to 3 presentations, not 4 as originally planned, but 3 presentations on Soviet-Russian intelligence operations in border regions. The first presentation is by Xinjiang. He's a PhD candidate from the Nanyang Technical University in Singapore, and he's working on civil-military relations, the Chinese People's Liberation Army, and Chinese intelligence history. He will be speaking about Stalin's spies versus Stalin's pawn, the rise and recoil of Soviet influence in interwar Xinjiang.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back. You know, it's always a special feeling when you have to talk about a very serious topic in the food coma hour. But I will try to make it as interesting as possible so you guys won't fade away on me. Today, I'll be speaking on the rise and recoil of Soviet influence in interwar Xinjiang. So let's just jump right in. First, let's get geographically situated. Here's a map of the Republic of China that existed from 1911 to 1949 on the mainland, and some will argue continue to exist on Taiwan today. The area shaded in red was the province of Xinjiang. Today it's known as the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, and this has a pretty terrible reputation internationally for the human rights abuse that's going on over there. But during the ROC era, these were the main characteristics of Xinjiang province. It was the largest province of China, yet sparsely populated, just 3 million people. 90% were of Turkic Muslim background. It was rich in resources, especially minerals and petroleum, and the province was barely under ROC central government's control. The provincial governors pretty much acted as autonomous entities. Also, it was the only part of Turkic Central Asia outside of Soviet control. If you look towards Xinjiang's west, you got Soviet Central Asia, Soviet Central Asian republics. If you look towards Xinjiang's east, you got Outer Mongolia and Tannu Tuva. Both were Soviet puppet states by 1930s. And when the Sino-Japanese War began in 1937, Xinjiang became the main conduit for foreign aid into China when the sea lanes became unavailable. So it's quite a strategic province during the wartime. Some key findings up front, I can say with confidence that Soviet intelligence operatives had successfully infiltrated the Xinjiang government and Xinjiang military since at least 1931. The Soviets were behind an April 12, 1933 coup in Xinjiang that removed the governor Jin Shuren and introduced Soviet dominance in the following years. In fact, the leader of the coup plotters was a Soviet agent named Chen Zhong. During the USSR's partnership with Jin's successor, Governor Sheng Shicai, there were concerted Soviet efforts to expand its control of the Xinjiang government, with the possibility of ultimately overthrowing Sheng if he evolved into a liability to Soviet interest. Some background towards the April 12th coup that sort of was a milestone in Xinjiang history. So under the first Republican governor of Xinjiang, seen on the top left, Yang Zengxin, he achieved what I call like a strategic parity between Xinjiang and USSR, because USSR was newly born at the time. It needed international trade partners. It needed friends on the international stage. So Yang demanded Xinjiang and USSR engage diplomatically on equal grounds, which the USSR agreed to. However, in 1928, Yang was assassinated, and his successor, Jin Shuren, seen at the lower right, took over, but he focused on expanding the provincial army, which put a great strain on the budget, in Xinjiang government's budget. And his narrow personalistic rule alienated both the masses and elites, which led to internal disorder and creeping Soviet influence. And during this time, the Soviets began to send intelligence operatives into Xinjiang with the goal of infiltrating the military and government there. The outbreak of the Hami Rebellion in 1931 in eastern Xinjiang quickly spread throughout the province as a wider Muslim uprising. You can see some of the leaders of this Muslim uprising right here. And within a year, pretty much 90% of the province slipped out of provincial government's control. And despite constant effort to combat the rebels, the provincial government could not retake these districts, which generated a lot of discontent among the ruling elites in the provincial capital against Governor Jin. Chen Zhong was a Soviet intelligence agent who persistently tried to infiltrate the Xinjiang government and succeeded finally in 1932. In his exchanges with Governor Jin, Chen Zhong portrayed himself as a victim of Soviet cruelty as an overseas Chinese living in the Soviet Union. And he submitted what I would call a prophetic report to Governor Jin on Soviet intentions regarding Xinjiang. I call it prophetic because a lot of these Soviet subversion tactics that Chen Zhong outlined in his report to the governor, they all came true in 1944 when the Soviets sponsored the Yili uprising in northwestern Xinjiang to challenge the Xinjiang government. So 10 years ago, he already outlined these tactics. They were all used 10 years down the line. So, through these exchanges, by portraying himself as a victim and submitting valuable information to the governor, Chen was promoted to a very high position in the Xinjiang government. However, once he got there, he started organizing anti-Jin forces in the government military. On April 12, 1933, Chen and the Naturalized Army, which was a Soviet proxy made out of mostly white Russian officers who learned how to cooperate with the Soviet Union, they launched a coup that successfully overthrew Jin's government. We don't have a photo of Chen Zhong, but here's the leader of the Naturalized Army at the time, Pavel Papengut. But Chen himself did not become the new leader of the new government. Instead, he backed General Sheng Shicai, seen right here, who commanded the bulk of the provincial army and to lead the new government. However, Sheng quickly executed Chen due to suspicious activities. A few months later, he also arrested the head of the Naturalized Army, Pavel Papengut, and had him executed a year later. So at the same time, Sheng initiated this charm offensive directed at Soviet representatives in Urumqi, Dihua, as well as in Moscow. He wrote letters directly to Stalin and Molotov and Voroshilov. And in these correspondence, he sought to charm them, by presenting himself as like this fervent Marxist, and demanded that the Soviets give support so he could communize China. And to a certain extent, despite seeming like a madman to Stalin, he did succeed in winning Soviet confidence, despite the mistrust underneath. He executed Soviet proxies and agents in Xinjiang. And Soviets intervened in Xinjiang on 2 occasions, once in January 1934, once in 1937, to eliminate Sheng's rivals and back up his government. And also, he received about 5 million gold ruble in loans to revive the provincial economy. And the first intervention in Xinjiang is actually quite interesting. Soviet OGPU troops, as well as Red Army troops, took off their uniform, put on unmarked green uniforms, and called themselves the Altai Volunteer Army and crossed into China. So, this 2014 little green man thing is actually just an old tradition. I don't know if it's the first time used in China or what, but there's definitely a precedent. Of course, nevertheless, it was an unequal relationship, right? Because Xinjiang was a weak, Xinjiang government is weak and impoverished, and Soviets had the resources of power, so they led the relationship. And under the instruction of Soviet Dihua Consul General Garygin Apresov, Xinjiang did underwent partial Sovietization, as opposed to full Sovietization that was occurring in Tannu Tuva and Outer Mongolia at the time. So how would we describe this Sheng-Soviet partnership, which, at its height was between 1933 to 1937? Soviet intelligence officers rose to prominent position in Xinjiang government, which was part of China. This is quite interesting because the Xinjiang government is more or less dominated by Soviet intelligence officers. There were 3 groups of Soviet intelligence operatives that went to Xinjiang: the 31 group, the 35 group, and the 36 group. They were mostly of Han Chinese descent, who were living in the Soviet Union. 90% were of Han Chinese. 10% were of Turkic Muslim background, like Uyghurs or Kazakhs that came from the Soviet Union. Respectively, the 31 group took over high offices in the Xinjiang Secret Police. 35 group took over the Xinjiang Marxist Anti-Imperialist Union, which was the de facto political party in the province. And the 36 group took over the Frontier Affairs Division, which was the provincial external intelligence body. All of them reported to Soviet Consul General Garygin Apresov, seen right here, who pretty much was the NKVD resident in the province. And he ran all the operations. As you can see, he got the Order of Lenin, which was awarded in September 1935 for quote-unquote works in Xinjiang that cannot be publicized. Yeah. So besides running operations, Apresov also frequently interfered in provincial governmental affairs. On numerous occasions, he strong-armed Sheng into appointing Soviet agents to powerful positions, despite the latter's reluctance to do so. And according to the memoirs of Chinese communist agents who attended the weekly meetings between these between Apresov and the spy leaders at the Dihua consulate, in July 1935, during a meeting, Apresov and a Comintern representative chaired the meeting at the consulate. And they declared that the Soviets did have the intention to control the Xinjiang government. And in fact, they told the spy leaders to speed up speed up their control, their attempt to control the Xinjiang government. And there's option to eventually take over if Sheng no longer benefited Soviet interest. In my study, I collected about a few dozens of Soviet spies in Xinjiang. I got their names and aliases, year of entry into Xinjiang, their membership in All-Union Communist Party, yes or no. The particular intelligence organization they were working for. Some worked for NKVD, some were from Red Army General Staff 3rd Directorate. Some were possibly OGPU. And their occupations and activities in Xinjiang and their exit from Xinjiang subsequent activities. But of course, Sheng himself, he's a military dictator. He's not really a willing pawn. So he was looking for opportunity to shake off Soviet influence, if possible. So an opportunity did emerge in 1936, when the Soviet Union itself descended into chaos with the Stalinist purges and the anti-Trotskyist frenzy. Sheng actually joined in on the witch hunt and accused Apresov, the Soviet consul general, and some of his subordinates as leaders of Trotskyists in Xinjiang. His subordinates and Apresov were sent back to the Soviet Union to be investigated in May 1937. A more pliant Soviet diplomat named Arthur Meny replaced Apresov's position in Xinjiang. And through these moves, Sheng regained control of the Xinjiang secret police. And he would not relinquish this grasp until 1944 when he left Xinjiang altogether. And in autumn of 37, Sheng widened the purge against real and imagined rivals in the Xinjiang government and emerged as the undisputed leader. In November 1937, another opportunity came about for Sheng to take back control of the Xinjiang Masses Anti-Imperialist Union, the de facto political party there. So in November, Moscow's favorite Chinese communist, Wang Ming, seen in the top right, he passed by Dihua on the way to Yan'an to seize power from Mao Zedong. And Wang had conflict with the leader of the 35 spy group, Yu Xiusong, and told Sheng that Yu was a Trotskyist. And a month later, Yu and his spies running the Anti-Imperialist Union, they were detained and then sent back to the USSR in 1938. Soviet authorities executed Yu in 1939 in the basement of Lubyanka. And Apresov was shot at the Medvedev Forest in 1941. And according to Mikoyan, Stalin executed Apresov because Apresov knew too much about Soviet activities in Xinjiang. So there's no memoirs from Apresov. He's gone forever. And after that, Sheng appointed a CEP agent as the head of the Anti-Imperialist Union. Why? I have my hypotheses. We can probably discuss that later. And the Frontier Affairs Division, an external intelligence agency controlled by the Soviets, was the only organization that remained unscathed in these purges. But a few years later, when the Xinjiang government's relationship with the Soviets broke down completely, this organization would also be purged. All right, to conclude, so after the April 12th coup, Sheng was pretty much seen as a fellow traveler or useful idiot by the Soviets, who was supposed to be a figurehead until no longer needed. However, his speedy elimination of Soviet agents around him made him the only option to collaborate with. Also, Sheng, his charm offensive did work to a certain extent by portraying himself as a committed Marxist. The Soviet Dihua consulate's domineering presence in Xinjiang was definitely felt. Soviet intelligence operatives took over key security, political, and intelligence organizations in the province. When the Great Purges started in the USSR, Sheng took the opportunity and struck back as Stalin's agents. And he hurled Trotskyist accusations and returned the spies back to the Soviet Union to be investigated. And they never returned. Through these maneuvers, Sheng safeguarded his regime and prevented Xinjiang from becoming a Tangnu Tuvar Outer Mongolia. where Soviet agents in the prior years seized power through subversion and coups. In the years following 1937, Sheng would attempt to balance the triumvirate between the Xinjiang government, the USSR, and the CCP until that was no longer possible. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Yang, for this interesting presentation and for giving the term Little Green Men a new meaning. We move on to the next presentation by Professor Aleksandar Životić. Is it correct? Yes? Correct, thank you. He's a professor at the Department of History at the Faculty of Philosophy at the Belgrade University, and he's interested in the history of the Yugoslavian state, especially military and diplomatic history, and the place of Yugoslavia in the Cold War. He will be presenting a paper on the Soviet military intelligence and the Kingdom of the Yugoslavia 1934 to 1941.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, as you're informed, today I will speak about Soviet intelligence in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia between 1934 and 1951. Actually, I will talk only about main lines of their work, because it is a very great topic with many sources. The activities of Soviet military intelligence in Yugoslav Kingdom have so far only been partially and fragmentarily researched. Recent research conducted in archives in Russia and Serbia, archives of the former Yugoslav state, and the recent memoir and diary literature provide us with a new and more complete picture of the Soviet intelligence presence in Yugoslavia. After the revolutionary changes in Russia, the newly created Kingdom of Yugoslavia did not have official diplomatic relations with Soviet Russia, and then with the Soviet Union until June 1940. Although official relations were not regulated due to its specific geostrategic position, pronounced anti-communism of King Alexander, close ties with France and membership of the Little Entente in the Balkan Pact was the subject of the special interest of the Soviet military intelligence service. Until 1934, when the Soviet Union regulated the relationship with Yugoslav allies, Czechoslovakia and Romania, and established diplomatic relations with Bulgaria, there was no opportunity for more specific intelligence work in Yugoslavia. From that moment, through the Soviet military missions in Turkey and Bulgaria, and a more serious observation of Yugoslavia and its armed forces began. The creation of an agency network in Yugoslavia, independent of the previous intelligence lines of the Comintern, the establishment of contacts with Yugoslav officers, which educated in Imperial Russia, and the hearing of the Russian emigrant for intelligence work in Yugoslavia. This is the first contacts in Bulgaria. It is a photo from personal collection of Yugoslav military attaché Colonel Dunic. He is the first from the right side with the Bulgarian King Boris and Soviet military attaché Colonel Dergachov. Despite the proclamated policy or approachment with Yugoslav Kingdom, various Soviet actions related to the operations of the Soviet intelligence service on its territory raised particular suspicions about the real Soviet intentions. A series of espionage affairs that broke out during the 35 and 36 raised doubts about the sincerity of Soviet intentions. A special object of Soviet intelligence work in Yugoslavia was the organization National Labor Union of the new generation, which the Soviet intelligence service tried to use in order to break the more radical immigrant organization in the first place of the Russian General Military Union. The first major incident occurred in 1935, when the first group of 11 Russian youths in the form of returns headed to the USSR under the organization of the Alliance. After they duly reported to the Soviet embassy in Vienna, they received permission to return, but upon entering the Soviet Union, they were arrested and killed. The cause special attention of the Yugoslav side, already at the beginning of the following year, a new espionage affair came to light in which the Soviet intelligence center, led by Captain Komarovsky, was discovered. The work of the intelligence center in Belgrade was organized by the employees of the Soviet consulate in Prague, Gorobetsky and Dr. Leonid Linitsky, Ivan Shkrabov, an Austrian citizen named Inchlich, and several other Russian immigrants participated in its work. The group collected information on the railways of strategic importance that were under construction or in plans, on German deliveries of military and railway material to Yugoslavia, as well as the other infrastructure facilities essential for the defense of the country. In addition, they collected documents of military nature and photographed military facilities. They made in contacts with the intelligence center in Prague through couriers, the correspondence, and invisible ink. Despite an intensive 3-month investigation, the police were unable to fully connect him to the Soviet intelligence service because his wives managed to destroy compromising documents before the police arrived to their apartment. That's why Linitsky was convicted only for stealing documents from the safe of one of the migrant organizations. A new affair soon followed, which was closely related to the Soviet kidnapping of General Miller. The investigation also led to chief of that organization, Treasurer Popeskulova, who was arrested in Belgrade to the request of the French police. A little later, Vladimir Vorontsov, a student of the University of Belgrade, who worked as an intelligence agent for the Soviets, was also arrested in Belgrade. He came to Belgrade via Latvia, where he already defected after being released from the camp on the Solovetsky Islands, where he allegedly spent 3 years as a member of the counter-revolutionary youth organization and the son of the shot imperial colonel. After that, he was expelled from Yugoslavia. Smaller groups of Russian immigrants who did intelligence work for the Soviet Union were organized by the Soviet Military Intelligence Center located in the Soviet office of the Soviet Military Attaché in Sofia. Active Soviet intelligence work on Yugoslav territory fueled existing fears of possible Soviet interference in the internal politics of Yugoslavia Kingdom and fueled suspicion of the event of the establishment of regular diplomatic relations. The Soviet embassy in Belgrade would become the center of the Soviet intelligence and propaganda activity. After 1935, as a result of Soviet Czechoslovakian rapprochement, the Soviet side was able to obtain reliable information about Yugoslav army and Yugoslav defense preparation from the Czechoslovak General Staff as an allied institution through the system of legal exchange of the information. As a part of mutual effort aimed at establishing official cooperation, the first contacts were established between the Soviet side and the Yugoslav military missions in Bulgaria, Turkey, and Czechoslovakia. At the same time, the more aggressive intelligence work of the Soviet side in Yugoslavia led to an intelligence scandal that results of the arrest of Soviet intelligence officers in Belgrade. The attempt of the Soviet Military Intelligence Service, in cooperation with Czechoslovakia, to influence the overthrow of the pro-German government of Milan Stojadinović complicated the process of normalization of relations and the establishment of cooperation at the intelligence levels. The rapprochement of Stojadinović's government with Germany and Italy on the foreign policy front caused a special suspicion of Soviet diplomacy. And in 1938, Stalin himself, responding to the secret political initiative of former prime minister, actual leader of opposition Bogoljub Jevtić, whose goal was to secure Soviet support primarily for changes on the internal and then on the external political scene. Fully agreed with the fact that Germany throughout history, citation, always expanded at the expense of the Slavs, not hitting his belief that will happen again in the near future. He expected the Germans to try with all their might to break out into the Adriatic, which was in no case possible without harming Yugoslav interests. This is why Stalin expected the Yugoslavia would eventually orient itself towards forces that can oppose the increasingly aggressive German expansion of German allies such as Hungary and Italy, which according to Stalin also always expanded at the expense of the Slavs. According to him, only the Soviet Union and France could do that on the European mainland. In this regard, he authorized the Soviet diplomacy to meet Bogoljub Jevtić, who most likely acting on behalf of his political party, but also of the secret organization conspiracy through an intermediary, presented to the Soviet side his views on the foreign policy position of Yugoslavia and the nature of international relations on the European in Europe, as well as seeing the future Yugoslav positioning in the international arena, and to give him to his political group the political and financial assistance that Jeftić indirectly requested. In accordance with its commitment to strengthening the alliance with France and creating a solid alliance of the European South and the East that would counter German penetration, Soviet diplomacy was ready to support Jeftić's proposal for the future of the Yugoslav foreign policy. They were trust in his intentions stemmed from the time when the Minister of Foreign Affairs tried to have the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, together with the other members of the Little Entente, recognize the Soviet Union. On the Soviet side, he enjoyed the reputation of a man of the future, a supporter of the policy of stronger inter-Balkan connections and the creation of axis between the Little Entente, Balkan Entente, and Soviet Union. However, the long-term absence of Yugoslav space, as well as misunderstanding of the internal Yugoslav political situation, only five. Please stand. The Balkan and the Soviet Union. However, the long-term absence from Yugoslav space, as well as misunderstanding of internal Yugoslav political situation, made the Soviet perceive Jeftić's political strength stronger. It was a reality and affair reaching foreign political interest to ignore a moment that his insensitive Soviet added goal to realization of his foreign policy program. Also, during the time, Prime Minister Živković, who in the meantime reconciled with Jeftić, an effort to consolidate the Yugoslav National Party, believed that must rely on France and Soviet Union imposing of German and Italian expansion. However, based on the available resources, we are not in position to confirm the testimony of the leading Soviet intelligence officer that time, Sudoplatov, who claims in his memoirs that the Czechoslovakian president Beneš approached Stalin with request for help overthrowing that government. What happened on the military intelligence level, according to the same sources, Stalin, acting in accordance with secret Soviet-Czechoslovakia agreement on mutual intelligence cooperation, ordered the NKVD to allocate a significant sum of money to finance a coup d'etat in Belgrade. Allegedly, the Soviet operative and resident in Prague, Pyotr Zubov, he was officer of military intelligence, was appointed by the Soviet state leadership to carry the task in Belgrade. After arriving in Yugoslav capital, got the impression that the Serbian officers organized of that coup chosen the Czechoslovakian intelligence service are adventurers who have no real strength, so independently made the decision not to hand them some $200,000 that he been as a side from purpose of the Soviet side. He immediately informed about that Kremlin and of his decision in a special telegram. After that, he was arrested in Moscow and he was in prison until autumn 39. But in July of 1940, after establishing of official relations, Soviet Union establishment their intelligence positions in Belgrade. The one was in over management of task correspondence, Roždestvenski, and his deputy Vasily Petrovich Grigoriev, and after that Poletaev. They maintained close ties with the political editor of semi-official newspaper Vreme, Misha Brašić, who, according to his admission, worked for Soviet intelligence service since 1932. This is a card of Soviet general staff. And this is arrival of the Soviet diplomatic mission in Belgrade with Roždestvenski and Poletaev in the second line. It is a Plotnikov ambassador in Yugoslavia and ministry and representative of Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The second part of the Soviet intelligence military work was camouflage in Soviet trade representatives in Belgrade. This is a Soviet representative. It is a Colonel Popović, Yugoslav military attaché in Moscow. He was educated in Imperial Russia, General Samokhin, military attaché and chief of Soviet Military Intelligence Center in Belgrade. His deputy, Colonel Maslov. He was, after the Second World War, one of the prominent Soviet officers. He leading Department for Foreign Relations in the Ministry of Defense of the Soviet Union, and he was especially active in terrain intelligence work. Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Larichev, he was deputy of military attaché and very prominent operative officer in Yugoslavia, especially during the German aggression in 1941. General Samokhin and Minister of Foreign Affairs Aleksandar Marković at the reception of the Soviet embassy. Viktor Plotnikov and Arkady Poletaev, correspondent of the TASS, one of the most important Soviet intelligence officers in Belgrade. And this is Poletaev, Dusan Petković, Yugoslav diplomat, and Miloš Brašić, Belgrade journalist and old Soviet agent in Belgrade under society. This is the signing of the Yugoslav-Soviet Pact in Moscow in April 1941. On the right side, we can see Colonel Dragutin Savić, Yugoslav intelligence officer, and retired Colonel Božin Simić, old Soviet agent in Yugoslav society, former Serbian officer and member of famous Black Hand organization. And that's it. And I can say only a few words. Despite the close relations and cooperation, the Soviet side did not refrain from more aggressive intelligence activities. After the few affairs, the arrest of Soviet journalist who was collecting information on military nature had the effect of reducing confidence of the Yugoslav side. During the German attack on Yugoslavia in April 1941, the Soviet military attaché followed the retreating Yugoslav government and general staff, collecting data of German and Italian armies, the formation of the independent state of Croatia and its armed formation, and the establishment of occupation and quisling regimes. After returning to Belgrade, until the evacuation of Soviet diplomats in Belgrade in the beginning of June 1941, the Soviet military attaché and his assistants were engaged in the plan of directing the work of the Soviet agency network, collecting data of the movements of German troops to the Eastern Europe, and forming intelligence centers that had a task to develop military intelligence activity of the territory of the occupied Serbia, and influence the creation of the armed structures of the communist resistant movement. And one word enough. I want to say something about cooperation between Yugoslav General Staff and Soviet military intelligence. It was on the level of sharing data about the Germans' positions in Central and Eastern Europe before the Barbarossa. Thank you very much.
Now we are up for the last presentation in this session. It's from Marek Hańderek. He's an assistant professor from the University in Krakow, and he's also a researcher here at the Historical Research Office at the Institute of National Remembrance. He will be presenting a paper on the role of Polish intelligence in the Soviet intelligence assessment of the situation in the People's Republic of China during the Cultural Revolution. The floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, as chairman said, I'm going to focus on Polish-Soviet cooperation in regard to China during the Cultural Revolution. So I'm going to focus on the first period, most turbulent period of the Cultural Revolution. So this will be the late 1960s and early 1970s. I will also tell you a few words about organization and objectives of Polish Rezydentura in China, or station, as Anglo-Saxons say. Moreover, I will identify intelligence sources on the PRC other than Rezydentura in China, what means that they not only collected documents on China soil, but also in other countries. And I will try to assess the scale of Polish intelligence on China shared with KGB. And finally, I will also try to point out main topics and subjects of these documents which were shared with the KGB. I have to tell you also that it wasn't something extraordinary that KGB and Polish intelligence service cooperated. And according to findings of Witold Bagiński, who is sitting here right now, this cooperation started in the 1950s. So firstly, there were so-called Soviet advisors closely cooperating with Polish civilian intelligence. Then 2 agreements on cooperation between Polish intelligence and KGB were signed. First one was signed in 1957, another one in 1971. And in general, throughout these decades, both services exchange thousands of documents. It's not easy to count precisely all of them, so I'm not able to show you precise numbers. And very often we can find out that something was shared with the Soviets thanks to this short acronyms PR, which meant Przyjaciele Radzieccy in Polish, and in English it will be Soviet friends. So sometimes only this PR suggested that document was shared with KGB. Sometimes, as you can see there, information was much more clear because it's stated that this particular document was sent to KGB. And now I would like to remind you a few important information about the Cultural Revolution and also about culmination of Sino-Soviet split, because it was connected. So as you remember, the Cultural Revolution was inaugurated in spring 1966. So China was focused for a few years mainly on internal affairs. It definitely limited foreign relations. Majority of Chinese diplomats were recalled to China. And what was also typical was the fact that many Chinese media, Chinese politicians and society, they were hostile toward foreigners. And when it comes to Sino-Soviet split, which started in the 1950s, in the 1960s there was a culmination, and a few important events took place. For instance, 18 days siege of Soviet embassy in Beijing in winter 1967. There was, of course, a continuous anti-Soviet propaganda in a whole country. And finally, in March 1969, border clashes occurred, and both sides were afraid that the opposite side planned to invade. So the communication between them was very limited because of the fact that there was no Soviet ambassador in China for a few years. So they didn't understand what were the plans of opposite side. And Soviet diplomats who remained in China, many of them feared for their lives. And in such circumstances, it's also obvious that gathering intelligence was very difficult for the Soviets. due to hostility and due to constant surveillance from Chinese counterintelligence. And now, what about Polish station or rezydentura? It was established in the middle of the 1960s. The resident worked as a Polish diplomat officially, and here we can see a photograph of a resident during the first period of the Cultural Revolution, Colonel Stefan Kwiatkowski. And usually he had two officers who constitute together with him the rezydentura, plus a few co-optees who worked under cover of Polish embassy or Polish consulates in Shanghai and Canton on Guangzhou. And also they recruited Polish co-optees among workers of Bloc, which is Polish-Chinese joint venture working also these days. And what is important, Bloc had its headquarters in Shanghai. What were the other sources of information about China? Because I said that they transferred not only documents collected in China, but also from other places. This is a little bit extraordinary, and it also shows the Soviet seek for information that in late 1960s, Poland started to share with KGB completely ordinary diplomatic reports written by their diplomats every month or once per half a year. It wouldn't happen in ordinary times, but Cultural Revolution was something extraordinary, as I said. So they sent many reports written by Polish diplomats who didn't cooperate with intelligence services. They also shared documents gathered by Polish stations in various countries like Austria, West Germany, Belgium, Switzerland, and other states. Poles and also KGB appreciated some informations gathered and delivered by agent which was recruited by Polish intelligence in Austria. It was Chinese journalist who then moved to Austria and received Austrian citizenship, and also agent recruited in the United States. He was former diplomat of one of Asian countries. In the 1960s, he had good relationships and connections with many politicians, also American intelligence officers, with members of President Johnson administration. So his information were very valuable from Polish and also a Soviet point of view, and from time to time he also presented American approach to communist China. And now about the numbers. As I said, it's not easy to count everything precisely. That's why these are approximate numbers. As you can see, in the late 1960s, they didn't exchange many documents. I believe that it was connected with the fact that the new chief of station started his duty in 1966, so he needed to learn something about China, he needed to meet people, he needed to recruit new informants and so on. But from 1969 and then 1970 and 1971, you see that they started to share quite a big number of documents with KGB. And as you can also see, Poles delivered much more than received from KGB on China. And to show you a scale or broader perspective, the last sentence is important. According, again, to findings of Witold Bagiński, we know that in 1970, Polish civilian intelligence shared over 1,000 documents with KGB and received 655. So among more than 1,000 documents, 10, maybe 11% of them concerned Chinese affairs. And what were the subject of these documents? So I presented a few categories here. So thank you. They collected quite a big number of documents in Shanghai, which concerned different aspects of cultural revolution inside the city and nearby the city. From Shanghai and Canton, they also delivered information concerning building of shelters and in general militarization of these two cities, about trade in these cities. So it's one category. Another documents concerned in general China's political and economic relations with foreign partners, and I found over 200 documents. And among these more than 200 documents, about 20 concerned Japan, because there was a process of rapprochement between China and Japan, and about 14 concerned the United States, because there were also talks in embassies, mainly in Warsaw, between Chinese and Americans. And then we had a visit of President Nixon and rapprochement of early 1970s, and 8 of them concerned Poland and Bloc shipping company. And there were also more than 120 documents concerning China's internal affairs, different topics like political turmoils, situation in Chinese Communist Party, economy, military build-up, ideology, and so on. And the last thing I would like to focus on is the importance of Shanghai, because as you can see, it's quite a big number of documents collected in Shanghai and which described situation in Shanghai. As you know, Shanghai used to be, and these days is also one of the largest trade centers in Asia. There was a, let's say, temporary collapse of the city when communists came to power, but then after a few years they modernized, developed the city, and again it was very important from Chinese point of view and for world trade as well. But in the first years of Cultural Revolution, almost all diplomats left Shanghai. So only Poles and North Vietnamese maintained diplomatic missions. I don't know if North Vietnamese in the 1960s spied on China. I'm not sure, because they expected assistance against the Americans. But for sure, Poles gathered intelligence, and they provided information, for instance, about building of shelters and fortifications. And from time to time, they even drew what they saw. So you can see one scheme of one of hundreds of shelters which were built in the late 1960s and early 1970s in Shanghai. They also provided information about relocation of industrial facilities outside the Shanghai Organization of Civilian Defense, arriving and departing airplanes, which they were able to observe. And I think that all this information, especially concerning military issues, might be very useful for Soviets, because, as I said, they didn't understand Chinese intentions, if they wanted to attack Soviet Union or if they just prepared to defense in case the Soviets attack. Well, it's probably more complicated, but I believe that building shelters, fortifications, relocations of industry might rather suggest that they wanted to be prepared in case of invasion. But I don't know how Soviets seen and understood these documents. And my last slide, conclusions. So we can say that in period 1967-71, and especially between 69 and 71, Polish civilian intelligence shared about 400 documents with KGB. As I said before, they definitely delivered more than received from Soviets about Chinese affairs, because they received about 50 documents. The documents which they shared with KGB concerned various subjects: foreign politics, internal politics, and different topics. Many documents gathered by Poles were more useful for Soviets than for Poland, because Soviet Union was a global superpower. Poland didn't have interest in various regions of the world, and they sometimes informed the Soviets about Chinese politics in various regions of Africa and so on. As I said, the role of Polish intelligence was significant during culmination of Sino-Soviet tensions, and they, for instance, sent documents which said that, for instance, I saw a train with Chinese soldiers going north, and everything was passed to Soviets, what at least mentioned that they were Chinese soldiers moving or gathering or arming themselves. This is also important, as I said, due to hostility towards the Soviets, they were not able to spy and gather intelligence. So Poles were in better position in this regard, and it especially this description especially relates to Shanghai. As I said, many documents concerned Shanghai. There was very productive co-opti. It was Polish vice consul who cooperated with intelligence, and he spoke Chinese, so it was a kind of his superpower, which helped him to produce a lot of valuable documents. That's all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, now the floor is open for questions. Should the presenters move up here and sit?
Thank you very much for your highly fascinating presentations. I have a question for Xinjiang. You were saying that the Soviet Union moved decisively into Xinjiang from 1931 onwards. Did they also use Xinjiang to render assistance to the Chinese communists? I mean, you once were mentioning Stalin's favorite Chinese communist, but I was wondering if support effort took on a more muscular form. And the second question is to Marek. The last slide in the end, you note the Poles were the only ones who could spy in Shanghai. Now, if I were a member of Chinese counterintelligence and know that the only people who maintain a station there are the North Vietnamese and the Poles, I mean, my task wouldn't be so difficult to try to prevent that. Did you find any evidence of, let's say, counterintelligence by the Chinese side? Thank you.
Well, it takes all wants to. Okay.
I have a question to Mr. Hańderek. Something that you mentioned on the margin of your presentation, that is Polish intelligence for KGB in Africa. Could you say a few more words about that, like where and why Polish, not Soviet? I mean, were they also suspected of anything like in Africa? Because it was like, well, those were the years of still some countries gaining independence in Africa. So I guess it might have been connected. So basically, like where and why?
I have a question for both Xinjiang and also for Mark. I'm going to mispronounce your last name. I'm so sorry. Okay, this has started out well. Anyways, I guess with one of the things that's often talked about with Xinjiang and Stalin is sort of Stalinist nationality policy. And I'm curious, sort of based on these letters seen from the point of view as being an intelligence, being about sort of trying to shake off Soviet intelligence officers, do you think that people in that leadership was sort of, that was part of sort of the charm offensive to Stalin to listen to that nationality policy stuff? And then I guess I'm curious if in the Polish files they're conducting any type of analysis about what they thought Chinese intentions were during the border dispute, or if they're just passing documents.
Going.
Perhaps we should let some of the speakers.
Yes. Maybe
answer some
one
of the
last
questions.
question, please.
Okay, so the last question, and we have a second round. Okay.
Because I have a question for Aleksandar. Because it seems you have been using largely Yugoslav sources for this work. Have you also been looking into the Soviet side of this? And in addition to this, maybe you could reflect about what Richard was talking about in the last panel if the Soviets were aware of the role that Yugoslavia might play in 41.
I don't know who will begin.
Okay. So when the war between China and Japan started in 1937, Soviets did provide huge amounts of aid to the Chinese government. The ROC government in Nanyang. They also provided through Xinjiang to the CCP as well in Yan'an. But the amount to the national government is like 100 to 1 in terms of how they divide aid. So very little towards CCP, but a lot to the government because they were the official government of China. They had the biggest army. And Soviets at the time, they were very fearful of a potential war in the East against Japan and a potential war in Europe against Germany, right? Of course, the aid dropped after the Soviets signed the Soviet-Japanese non-aggression pact. Yeah, so because at the time they feel more secure, so they gave less aid. I believe it was called Operation Z, the provision of aid to China. Yeah, but before 1937, there were also attempts from the Soviet side to sort of link up with the CCP, because CCP went through the whole long march through half of China, and it ended up in this very remote corner of, called Yan'an, that's sort of like cut off from everywhere. So once they reached Yan'an, they dispatched about 21,000 Red Army soldiers to march towards the west to sort of link up with Xinjiang, which was partially Sovietized, and get Soviet that way. But it failed miserably. The Soviets, the leader of that particular 21,000 unit, they were it was called the West Route Army, and the leaders. Some CCP cadres met with Stalin and Voroshilov and Molotov in Moscow, and they say, we have 21,000 going towards the west. If we link up, could you provide us with aid in Xinjiang? And Stalin promised, according to the CCP cadres memoir, about 90 tanks and a similar amount of artillery pieces once they reached Xinjiang. But they were beaten so badly on the way to Xinjiang, only about 500 of them got to Xinjiang. So, of course, they didn't get that much aid. So at the time, Soviet interest was to, fend off the Japanese. So when the war started, they supported the national government more than the CCP. With regards to the nationalities question, that's actually part of the partial Sovietization policy in Xinjiang under Governor Sheng. He adopted actually the way Stalin classified, ethnic groups and nationalities. There's few traits, right, you have to fulfill, but I'm not an expert. I don't remember. But it was during that time when the government officially recognized Uyghur nationality, Kazakh nationality, et cetera, and they established these called a Uyghur Cultural Advancement Society, Kazakh Cultural Advancement Society, to establish government control of how information and knowledge is produced in these communities. So before, the Xinjiang government sort of just left them to their own devices, to be governed by their traditional khans, their traditional, mufti, khoja, whatever. But once the partial Sovietization started, the Xinjiang government adopted how Soviets manage nationalities. And one interesting thing is that, the Han Chinese, they're only made up 5% of the population, but they always dominated the military and the government. And when the Soviets inserted these agents back into Xinjiang, they chose mostly 90% of Han Chinese background. And because in a way, they feel that a Turkic Muslim cannot be a 100% dyed-in-the-wool communist, but a Han Chinese can, and they can work for Soviet interest. Yeah, thanks.
In regards to first question concerning surveillance and counterintelligence in Shanghai, for sure they were aware of this, and actually I have to emphasize that those who, let's say, spied in Shanghai were Polish diplomats working in consulate, and also people who worked in Hippelbrock shipping companies, so sailors. And they didn't do something extraordinary. They, I don't know, walked to the job through the streets. Then they tried to behave completely in an ordinary way. They didn't even try to recruit Chinese informants or agents. No attempts of this kind were made during Cultural Revolution. So their information based on things which they saw on their own eyes. So as I said, if they saw that, for instance, or something what they heard during walks or when they ride a bus, sometimes the base for information was that I drove a bus and I heard conversation. And in conversation, they said that there is industrial facility which will be moved outside the city. So this kind of information were provided, but almost all of them were shared with KGB. So that's what I can tell you. In regard to Africa, well, I mentioned this Africa as only example because they covered a lot of different topics and regions. They also inform about Chinese politics toward Europe, Asia, Middle East, and so on. But as I said, they did so because the Soviet Union was interested in learning what were Chinese plans toward the different regions of the world. And as you said, probably it was also connected with many nations wanted to gain independence yes, and sometimes, or maybe very often, this information concerning other countries and various regions of the world were gathered not in China, but in other countries. I said that they also transferred to Soviets information gathered in Western Europe or in the United States, and very often this information based on conversations with journalists, politicians, with diplomats from Western countries. So it didn't based on top secret documents, usually, as I said, based on conversation. And the third question concerned border clashes and actually, while preparing this presentation, I was mainly focused on counting these documents transferred to the Soviets. There were hundreds, as you have seen, of documents and thousands of pages, so I didn't read all of them carefully. But my impression was that they didn't try to deeply analyze Chinese politics. I mean, these co-optists didn't try. Maybe officers and maybe people working in headquarters, they collected these documents, information, and then from time to time, they prepared information, for instance, for Polish authorities about situation in China, about general tendency in Chinese foreign politics. But I didn't find particular analytics concerning border clashes of 1969.
Okay, dear Thomas, thank you for your questions. At first, I researched in former Yugoslav archives in Belgrade, Archive of Yugoslavia, and military archive. And I researched in Moscow too, especially in archive of social and political history, so-called Rogaspi, and Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense. What was the role of the Yugoslav during the March and April of 41? after the officers' coup in Belgrade, Hitler's decided to punish Yugoslavia, Serbian factor in Yugoslavia, especially Belgrade, not Belgrade as only a capital of Yugoslav state, but as center and he said a nest of Serbian officer conspiracy organizations. But that decision delayed German preparations for Barbarossa for 6 weeks. And it is importance of that moment. But during the period between establishing an official diplomatic relations between Yugoslav Kingdom and Soviet Union in June of 1940 to the April of 41, Yugoslav military intelligence and the Soviet military intelligence established a very intensive cooperation. Because after the fall of the France, as a pillar of Yugoslav national security, Yugoslav generals believed that only Soviet Union could add Yugoslav military efforts during that time, and that Soviet Union only had power to delay the German aggression on the east. Yugoslavia during that period had very good intelligence positions in Budapest, Bucharest, and Sofia, and especially in Berlin, where the Yugoslav military attaché, Colonel Vauchnik, had a personal cooperation and everyday communication with the chief of Abwehr, Admiral Canaris. And Yugoslav General Staff shared that information about German military preparation, about their positions, their deployment, and the structure of their military power, especially on the European East. During that period, Soviet intelligence officers in Belgrade had good position in general staff, especially in intelligence department of general staff and in cabinet of the Ministry of War, General Nedić during that period.
I think we will move on to the next round of questions. Sylvia, I saw an army of hands over there. Okay, yeah. Okay.
Marek, what was the level of competence or possibly incompetence of the Polish operators working against China? Are we talking about teams of train and plane spotters? Or are we talking about the people who got a serious training and education to understand, read, communicate with the Chinese people?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I have a comment and suggestion to Marek, and want to make a plea for the competence of the Polish officers and the Polish diplomats. There were regular meetings in the embassies of the Warsaw Pact, minus Romania, plus Mongolia, almost weekly, bi-weekly in Beijing. And the Poles were the only ones who could travel outside Beijing once in a while to Shanghai because of the consulate. And the Poles had some information outside of the confined area of Beijing. And those documents, I only know the East German ones, which are very meticulous, but if the Poles did similar record keeping, the Foreign Ministry archive, or basically the Polish embassy, should have recorded all that. And there you can basically see where all the ambassadors take turns and share what they know, what they have. The Soviets usually know a bit more about military things. The Soviet guy always starts, but then the others also chime in and have a lot to say. In particular, the Poles have a lot to say. So if you combine those two, what you have from the IPN archives plus the foreign ministry, the Poles will shine a bit brighter in this context, just because they had this consulate, which they had it was open because of the shipyard, obviously. Otherwise, they would have closed it down. But you can really emphasize the role of Poland a bit if you combine. It's just a suggestion if you want to. If you combine it with the foreign ministry, and then it will become even clearer that the Poles had some exclusive access during this period that no other Warsaw Pact country had at the time.
Do you have a question? Okay, Radek.
I have a question, or maybe partly comment to Young. Do you think that this particular story is a kind of a model for further Soviet attempts to organize and then run the so-called puppet government in different parts of Europe, of the world, certainly, including the situation in Central Europe? So maybe this is a model or some situation, or this particular situation might influence the methods of Sovietization in other parts of the world. This is the question, and I also have a kind of a comment to Marek, to remind Professor Rowiński, who one of the Polish diplomat who were in Beijing at the time, but he was also the historian, or actually the politologist, writing a lot on China. And okay, due to his personal experience, what he was writing also under the name Halimarski, is very important to understand what actually happened in China in this period. Thank you.
Okay, we have 2 questions first, okay? Okay.
A question for Aleksandar. You already partially answered this because my question was going to be about the liaison between Yugoslav military intelligence and Soviet military intelligence. So you already discussed that to some extent, but who were the Soviet recipients? Were they military attachés in Belgrade? Was it in Moscow? What was the mechanics of that transfer?
Just a quick comment about Marek's presentation. And you mentioned the Hippelbrock company. And the funny thing is, this company was established in 1951 and it's still operating. It still exists more than 70 years now. And it was used by both sides for espionage purposes because it had 2 headquarters in Shanghai and in Gdańsk, in Gdynia. So the both sides use this as a place for, as a back channel and also for gathering information. But my question is, if the Poles were spying in China at the time, collecting information about the events and so on, so what did the Chinese here in Warsaw? And can we compare, Polish espionage in China and Chinese espionage in Poland at the same time, how they differed? I know it's limited, we don't have much knowledge, but maybe based on your findings, you will be able to check and to compare those activities. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the question. Yeah, I think it's a really good point. If we think about the first Soviet satellite state, where was it? It was not in Europe, right? It was outer Mongolia, nowadays Mongolia. So how the Soviet took control of this state was that it supported Mongolian independence, it supported a figure that can unite all the factions, and gradually
they would try to push this figure to adopt more Soviet policies. If he refused, they'll find ways to get rid of him and put more left candidates into power until you get a Stalinist that's just completely subordinate to Moscow's will, and it's over, right? You completely become a Soviet satellite. Same story occurred in Tuva. They got a figure that's more like center left. When he refused more Sovietization policies, such as decimating the Tibetan Buddhist church, collectivization, Soviets in Tuva 1929, they sent students from the Moscow Communist University of the Toilers of the East, which were pretty much they were indoctrinated to serve Soviet interest. Went back at a central committee meeting, got rid of the guy in power in 1929, Tuva coup. And then afterwards, by 1944, Tuva was pretty much just a total Stalinist state. And they applied to join the Soviet Union as the ASSR. And today we have Tuva, which is still part of Russia, the homeland of Sergei Shoigu. So that's just how the process works. I don't know about Eastern Europe. Probably it's a similar story, right? So the model was tried first in the Far East and later replicated elsewhere. Yeah.
When it comes to Henry's question concerning how they were prepared to serve in China and to spy in China, I would say that it depended on a particular person. My general observation, because I did research on the Polish consulate in Shanghai during a whole Cold War period, and one of conclusions is that they recruited almost all of them, I mean consul or deputy consul, to cooperate with Polish intelligence. In the 1970s, also Polish military intelligence opened their residentura there. So from 1950s until 1981, at least one of their consul and his deputy cooperated with Polish intelligence. In the 1980s, Polish civilian intelligence set up completely new residentura in Shanghai, and 3 employees, all of them were officers or were recruited by officers as co-optees. So Shanghai was very important from a Polish intelligence service point of view. And some of these co-optees were very productive. I mentioned the one who cooperated in the late 1960s. He was a sinologist, so he spoke Chinese. But on the other hand, there were also consuls who spoke no foreign language, with exception of Russian, but Chinese didn't want to speak Russian in the 1960s and 1970s. So when this second consul I'm talking about now, when he provided information to Polish intelligence, they usually said that it's nothing special, we are not interested in this kind of information. So there were people well educated and really prepared, but sometimes, yes, we can say that it wasn't something valuable what they were able to gain. But when it comes to Polish officers, for instance, the one I mentioned, resident from the late 1960s, he was experienced intelligence officers because previously he served in Canada and earlier in, I forgot in which countries, maybe Witold knows, but he left probably. Anyway, he spoke English, Russian. He had 2 deployments before he was deployed to China, and his service was evaluated as very good by headquarters, but sometimes there were also officers who, for instance, spoke only Russian or English, but not fluently. And usually headquarters didn't treat them as very good and useful officers. that's all what I can tell you briefly. Bernd, thank you very much for your comments. Actually, you confirmed my thesis that Polish information gathered in Shanghai were useful for the Soviets in the late 1960s, and probably it would be very valuable to compare what we have in Polish documents and what, for instance, they had in East German records. Regarding Przemek's comment, yes, I probably mentioned that Hippelbrock exists until today, and we can only guess that both sides probably use this company not only for official purposes, I would say. And when it comes to Chinese spying in Poland, actually I didn't research this topic, but you probably know that in our archive we have a lot of documents produced by counterintelligence which concern Chinese diplomats here in Warsaw, in general in Poland, also Chinese officials working in Hippelbrock office in Gdynia. So it's a good topic for another research to check what did they do here and what Polish counterintelligence knew about their operations, goals, etc.
Okay, about roads and mechanism of intelligence cooperation between Yugoslavia and Soviet Union. Actually, between June of 40 and April of 41 existed two roads of that cooperation. At first, it is a line between Soviet Military Intelligence Center in Belgrade and informations shared to main intelligence directorate, famous GRU in Moscow, to General Golikov, and after that to the Chief of the General Staff, General Meretskov, and Minister of Defense, Marshal Timoshenko. The second road was via Yugoslav military attaché, Colonel Žarko Popović, who had excellent positions in Moscow because he was a former Russian cadet and he was fluent in Russian. He had directly communication with General Golikov, chief of main intelligence department, and with Marshal Timoshenko, Ministry of Defense. During that conversations, he put them very important informations about German positions and intentions in the eastern part of Europe. And especially for Soviets, existed one very, very important document. It is ended report of General Samokhin after the German aggression and after so-called April War at May of 1941 on very, very big, elaborate. It is around 50 pages. He write. That paper consists of his analysis of German tactics, military equipment, about German doctrine, and about weapons, about vehicles during the aggression on the Yugoslavia. It was valuable for Soviet General Staff, especially they said that it was very important for their operative department because it was a fresh image of German army in that moment. It was only 2 months before German aggression on Soviet Union.
Excuse me, because I forgot to refer to Władek's remarks. May I? So thank you very much for your comments. Of course, you are right that Professor Rowiński was also a very important Polish diplomats and academic, and also a sinologist who worked in China during Cultural Revolution. So his reports as a diplomat were very appreciated in Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But as far as I know, he was also later recruited by, I'm almost sure that they called him diplomat or something, but not 100%. I have to check it because I saw documents produced by him also in this intelligence files.
Usually signed by his name, his open, normal, regular name, not by the code name or something like that, which is typical for the. So his status was okay, something in between, because they told him our man in Beijing or something like that, but still he should, as a recruited agent, he should have a kind of a nickname or something like that, pseudonym, and he. As far as I know, I don't know the code name for his case, so I don't know. This is a kind of exception to the rule.
I'm going to check it.
Just wait.
Thank you very much. Sorry for this additional comment about Rodziński, but as Rowiński. So, as far as I remember from Polish Security Service file on him, well, they were very suspicious about him. When Adam Rapacki, as a Polish foreign minister, proposed him as a candidate to be a Polish ambassador in Beijing, there was veto from Polish internal ministry, and it was personal decision by Gomułka that he was sent to Beijing. And what is a very interesting question, that the British security service suspected that he was an agent of Soviet intelligence service, and in 70s they didn't want to give him a visa to come to United Kingdom. I wrote about it in a chapter which will be published from one of the early conference. Need to know. So this is interesting. Okay, so
Władek, I think that we don't have a time. Maybe.
As a witness, because I knew Professor Rowiński because during my short stay at the Polish Ministry for Foreign Affairs, we simply sit in one room, so that's why I know him personally, and he also is a part. Later, he became a part of my family because he is quite close relative of my wife. But okay, but he told me there's a part of the story of his relations with the British during this siege of the foreign embassies in Beijing, not only the Soviet ones, but also the Western embassies. The Poles also managed to help the British diplomats to escape the attacks by the Chinese young communists, and so from this situation on, the opinion on Rowiński by the British was changed, and he was allowed to come to Hong Kong finally and realize his dream. So thank you very much for this Rowiński story, and we can now go back. Okay. You have.
I don't know if we have the time for a third round without ending up in a Polish fist fight.
Only 5 minutes.
5 minutes?
5 minutes.
Any more questions? No, it doesn't seem like it. Then thank you to our presenters, to our speakers. And then I have been ordered. Yes. I've been ordered to hand over the chair here for Dr. Burak and also President Fries. Here you go.
Okay. So we have this rare privilege to conclude, to close our conference at this point. I'm afraid, and also somehow happy, that everything went almost perfectly, I hope. Yeah. So everything went almost perfectly, mostly thanks to my colleagues who are, part of them are sitting here, part of them are not here, but my warmest thanks goes to Sylvia. And also to our, we have a lot of partners, and okay, but in this point, I think that I should say that it was actually our joint conference of the Institute of National Remembrance over a central point, history point of Institute of National Remembrance. In this beautiful place, we actually opened for international cooperation of our institute. But okay, now the words goes to our strategic partner in this conference, Thomas Wegener-Fries, representing the IIHA.
Yes, and I will just finish up thanking you all for coming here on behalf of the IIHA. I think it's been once more a great success, and we extend our warmest thanks to our local Polish partners and to all the other partners who have been part of this journey as well. I wish you all a very nice flight or train ride or a walk back wherever you come from, and hope to see you again next year.
Yes, and also we would like to thank to our viewers on the internet who are have also the possibility to follow our discussion, to follow our thesis. As far as I remember, the most important thesis of our conference, that's that the past matters for present, and maybe tradecraft changed a little bit, maybe ideology changed a little bit, but Russian stayed Russian. Thank you very much.